morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as guard Thomas Mitchell took his position at the main gate. At 28 years old, Thomas had served in the Queen's Guard for 6 years, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. His red tunic was perfectly pressed, his bearskin hat positioned exactly as regulations demanded, and his rifle held at the precise angle he had practiced thousands of times. Thomas understood the weight of his role. He wasn't just a soldier standing guard. He was a living symbol of British tradition, discipline, and unwavering dedication. Tourists from around the world came to see the guards, hoping to witness the famous stoic composure that had become legendary. Many tried to make them laugh, move, or react in some way, but Thomas had been trained to remain completely still and focused, no matter what happened around him. The palace grounds were already bustling with activity. Tour groups gathered near the gates, cameras flashing as visitors captured photos of the iconic red-uniformed guards. Thomas could hear multiple languages being spoken, as people from different countries shared their excitement about seeing the famous Queen's Guard in person. Children pointed and whispered, while their parents explained the importance of these soldiers who protected the royal family. As the morning progressed, Thomas noticed a particular group of tourists who seemed more interested in testing the guards than simply observing them. There was a middle-aged man with his family who kept making loud comments, clearly hoping to get some kind of reaction. The man's wife appeared embarrassed by his behavior, gently trying to pull him away, but he persisted in his attempts to break the guard's concentration. Thomas had encountered similar situations countless times before. Part of his training included learning how to block out distractions, ignore provocative behavior, and maintain his duty regardless of what tourists might do. He focused on his breathing, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead, and reminded himself of the oath he had taken when he joined the guard. His commitment wasn't just to stand still. It was to uphold centuries of tradition and represent the very best of British military discipline. The crowd continued to grow as more tour buses arrived. Thomas could sense the anticipation building among the spectators. Some visitors seemed to understand and respect the solemnity of his duty, maintaining a respectful distance and speaking in hushed tones. Others, however, viewed the guards as entertainment, not fully grasping the serious nature of their role or the rigorous training required to achieve such level of discipline and control. The particular tourist who had been making loud comments earlier was now becoming more aggressive in his attempts to provoke a reaction. Marcus Weber, a businessman from Germany visiting London with his wife and teenage daughter, had already tried several tactics. He had made jokes about the guard's hat, commented loudly about how uncomfortable the uniform must be, and even waved his hands in front of Thomas's face, all while his family watched with growing embarrassment. Marcus seemed to view the situation as a personal challenge. He had heard stories about the guard's legendary composure, and apparently decided he would be the one to break it. His wife Elena kept whispering for him to stop, but Marcus dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. He pulled out his phone and began recording, clearly planning to capture whatever reaction he might provoke. Other tourists began to notice the escalating situation. Some moved closer, curious to see what would happen, while others backed away, sensing that something inappropriate was developing. A few British tourists looked particularly uncomfortable, understanding the cultural significance of what Marcus was attempting to do. They recognized that he wasn't just bothering a guard. He was disrespecting a treasured institution. Thomas remained perfectly still throughout all of this. His training had prepared him for exactly these kinds of situations. He had learned to enter an almost meditative state, where external distractions simply couldn't penetrate his focus. His breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged, and his gaze fixed on the predetermined point in the distance that helped him maintain his concentration. Inside his mind, Thomas reminded himself of the stories his grandfather had told him about serving in the guard during much more challenging times. His grandfather had stood watch during air raids, remained at his post through terrible weather, and maintained his duty, even when truly serious threats had emerged. Compared to those experiences, dealing with an obnoxious tourist was merely a minor irritation. The situation was beginning to attract the attention of other guards and palace security. From his peripheral vision, Thomas could sense additional personnel taking notice of what was happening, However, protocol dictated that he should handle the situation through his own composure, unless an actual security threat emerged. This was still just inappropriate tourist behavior, not a genuine danger. Marcus's daughter tugged at his sleeve, clearly mortified by her father's actions. She could see the disapproving looks from other tourists and understood that her father was making a spectacle of himself. Several people had begun recording the incident with their phones, but not to support Marcus's behavior. Instead, they seemed to be documenting what they perceived as inappropriate conduct toward a respected institution. Frustrated by his complete failure to get any reaction from Thomas, Marcus decided to escalate his behavior even further. He had purchased a cup of hot tea from a nearby vendor just minutes earlier, and now an unfortunate idea formed in his mind. He looked at the steaming cup, then at the motionless guard, and despite the horrified expressions of his family members, he began to approach Thomas with the tea in hand. Elena grabbed her husband's arm, speaking urgently in German, but Marcus shook her off. Other tourists began to realize what might be about to happen, and a murmur of concern rippled through the crowd. Several people called out, trying to discourage Marcus from whatever he was planning, but he ignored them completely. His focus was entirely on the guard who had refused to acknowledge his previous attempts at provocation. Thomas sensed the change in the crowd's energy without moving his eyes from their fixed position. His peripheral vision caught the movement of the man approaching, and his trained instincts began to assess the potential threat level. However, even as his mind processed the situation, his body remained absolutely motionless. Years of discipline had taught him that maintaining composure was often the best way to de-escalate situations. The crowd fell increasingly silent as Marcus raised the cup of hot tea. His wife had stopped trying to intervene and instead covered her face with her hands, unable to watch what her husband was about to do. Their daughter had pulled out her phone, not to encourage her father, but to document what she hoped would serve as evidence of his inappropriate behavior. Palace security officers, who had been monitoring the situation from a distance, began moving closer. However, they were trained to allow the guards to handle these situations when possible, intervening only when necessary. The guards' reputation for unshakable composure was part of their effectiveness, and premature intervention could undermine that reputation. Other tourists formed a wider circle around the scene, some recording with their phones while others simply watched in shocked silence. Many international visitors didn't fully understand the cultural significance of what was happening, but they could sense the tension and inappropriateness of Marcus's behavior. British tourists in the crowd looked particularly upset, recognizing this as an attack on one of their most cherished traditions. Thomas could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. This moment would test everything he had been trained for. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind about duty, honor, and representing something larger than oneself. Whatever happened in the next few moments, he knew that his response would either uphold or diminish the reputation that generations of guards had built through their unwavering dedication. Without warning, Marcus threw the contents of his teacup directly at Thomas's face and uniform. The hot liquid splashed across the guard's red tunic and struck his exposed skin. But Thomas did not flinch, blink, or move even a millimeter. The tea dripped down his face and soaked into his ceremonial uniform. Yet he remained as motionless as a statue, his expression completely unchanged. The crowd gasped in collective shock and horror. Several people immediately began shouting at Marcus, expressing their outrage at what he had just done. Elena rushed forward to grab her husband, apologizing profusely in broken English while tears of embarrassment streamed down her face. Their daughter stood frozen, her phone still recording, unable to believe what her father had actually done. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Marcus seemed stunned by his own actions, as if he hadn't fully considered the reality of what throwing hot tea at another human being would mean. He stood there holding the empty cup, suddenly realizing the gravity of what he had done as dozens of angry faces turned toward him. Thomas felt the hot tea burning slightly on his skin and running down inside his uniform, but his training took over completely. Every muscle in his body remained controlled, every breath measured and steady. His mind focused on a single point of concentration that blocked out the physical discomfort and the chaos erupting around him. This was the ultimate test of everything he had been taught about duty, discipline, and service. Palace security officers immediately moved in, not to assist Thomas, but to deal with Marcus. They approached the tourist with professional efficiency, speaking calmly but firmly as they escorted him away from the guard post. Marcus offered no resistance, appearing shocked by the magnitude of his own behavior and the hostile reaction from the surrounding crowd. Other tourists began approaching Thomas with tissues and offers of help, but protocol prevented him from acknowledging their assistance. Several British visitors looked close to tears, deeply moved by witnessing such an extreme example of dedication and self-control. They understood they were seeing something remarkable, a display of human discipline that few people ever witness firsthand. The incident had transformed the atmosphere completely. What had started as typical tourist curiosity had become something much more serious and profound. The crowd that remained seemed to recognize they were witnessing history in the making, a moment that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. The guard's absolute composure in the face of such inappropriate treatment had elevated the situation from a simple tourist prank to a demonstration of extraordinary character and commitment. As palace security escorted Marcus away, the remaining tourists stood in stunned silence, watching Thomas continue his duty as if nothing had happened. The tea had left dark stains on his red tunic and was still dripping from his face, but his posture remained absolutely perfect. His rifle stayed at the exact same angle, his gaze fixed on the same distant point, and his breathing remained steady and controlled. Word of the incident began spreading quickly among the crowd. Tourists who had witnessed the event started telling others what had happened, and more people gathered to see the guard who had maintained his composure despite being attacked with hot tea. Many visitors pulled out their phones to take pictures, but now their motivation was entirely different. Instead of trying to provoke a reaction, they wanted to document what they recognized as an extraordinary display of professional dedication. Elena Weber remained near the scene, crying and repeatedly apologizing to anyone who would listen. She approached several British tourists, explaining that her husband's behavior did not represent their family's values or their respect for British culture. Her daughter stood beside her, equally mortified and adding her own apologies. Both women seemed genuinely distraught by Marcus's actions and the embarrassment it had caused. Thomas could hear the conversations happening around him, including the apologies from Marcus's family members, but his training required him to remain focused on his duty, regardless of external circumstances. The physical discomfort from the hot tea was manageable, though he could feel the liquid continuing to make his uniform damp and uncomfortable. More concerning was the potential damage to his ceremonial dress, which held significant historical and symbolic importance. Senior palace staff arrived to assess the situation. They spoke briefly with security officers and observed Thomas from a respectful distance, clearly impressed by his handling of the incident. According to protocol, Thomas would need to complete his scheduled guard duty before he could be relieved and attend to his uniform and any potential injuries from the hot tea. The crowd's behavior had completely transformed. Tourists now spoke in hushed, respectful tones, many expressing amazement at what they had witnessed. Several people commented that they had never seen such an incredible example of self-discipline and professionalism. Parents used the moment to teach their children about duty, respect, and the importance of maintaining one's composure even in difficult circumstances. British tourists in particular seemed deeply moved by the incident. Many approached other visitors to explain the historical significance of the Queen's Guard and why Thomas's response was so remarkable. They shared stories about the rigorous training required to become a guard and the centuries of tradition that Thomas had upheld through his unwavering dedication to duty. As Thomas continued his guard duty with tea-stained uniform and unwavering composure, news of the incident began spreading beyond the immediate crowd. Several tourists had recorded videos of Marcus throwing the tea and Thomas's incredible response, and these clips were quickly shared on social media platforms. Within hours, the story of the Royal Guard's extraordinary professionalism was being discussed around the world. The videos showed not only the shocking moment when Marcus threw the hot tea, but also Thomas's complete lack of reaction. Viewers were amazed to see him remain absolutely motionless, his expression unchanged, his duty continuing without the slightest interruption. Comments poured in from people expressing admiration for such dedication and criticizing Marcus's inappropriate behavior. Marcus himself was being processed by palace security and local authorities. The incident was being treated as assault, and he faced potential criminal charges for his actions. His wife and daughter waited anxiously, still apologizing to anyone who would listen and trying to distance themselves from his behavior. Elena explained to officers that her husband had been drinking earlier, and that this was completely out of character for him. Though she acknowledged that alcohol was no excuse for such conduct, Thomas's fellow guards, who had witnessed the entire incident, were filled with pride and respect for their colleague's performance. They understood better than anyone how difficult it would have been to maintain such perfect composure while being attacked with hot liquid. During their brief moments of permitted communication, they expressed their admiration for Thomas's handling of what could have been a very serious situation. Palace officials were conducting their own review of the incident, not because Thomas had done anything wrong, but because they wanted to ensure proper protocols had been followed and to determine if any security procedures needed adjustment. They were particularly impressed that Thomas had managed to maintain his duty while the situation was resolved around him, demonstrating exactly the kind of professionalism the Queen's Guard was famous for. The international media began picking up the story, with news outlets around the world reporting on the incident. Headlines praised Thomas's composure and criticized tourist behavior that crossed lines of basic respect and decency. The story became a talking point about appropriate behavior when visiting cultural sites and respecting the people who work to maintain important traditions. Tourism officials expressed concern that incidents like this might damage London's reputation as a welcoming destination, but they also noted that Thomas's response had actually enhanced the reputation of British institutions. His behavior had demonstrated exactly the qualities that made the Queen's Guard legendary, turning what could have been a negative incident into a powerful example of dedication and professionalism. When Thomas's shift finally ended several hours later, he was relieved by another guard with the same precision and ceremony that marked every changing of the guard. As he marched away from his post, the crowd that had remained to witness his dedication burst into spontaneous applause. Tourists from around the world clapped and cheered, showing their appreciation for what they had witnessed. Thomas maintained his military bearing as he left the public area, but once inside the palace buildings, his superior officers immediately approached to check on his condition and commend his performance. The tea had caused some minor skin irritation, but nothing serious. His uniform, however, would require professional cleaning and possible repair to restore it to ceremonial standards. The commanding officer personally congratulated Thomas on his handling of the situation, noting that his response had upheld the highest traditions of the Queen's Guard. The incident would be recorded in official reports as an example of exemplary conduct under challenging circumstances. Thomas's actions had not only maintained the dignity of his position, but had actually enhanced the reputation of the entire unit. Marcus Weber faced legal consequences for his actions, including charges of assault and creating a public disturbance. He was required to pay substantial fines and was banned from visiting royal properties in the future. His family issued a public apology, and Elena later donated money to a charity supporting veterans, trying to make some amends for her husband's behavior. Their daughter wrote a letter expressing her admiration for Thomas's professionalism and apologizing for her father's actions. The incident became a teaching moment used in training programs for new guards, demonstrating how proper discipline and mental preparation could help soldiers handle even the most unexpected and inappropriate situations. Thomas's response was studied as a perfect example of maintaining duty and honor, regardless of external circumstances. Videos of the incident continued to circulate online for months, with millions of views and countless comments praising Thomas's incredible self-control. The story became legendary among both military personnel and civilians, representing the very best qualities of dedication, service, and professionalism. Tourism to Buckingham Palace actually increased as people hoped to see the famous guard who had shown such remarkable composure. Thomas returned to his regular duties, but he was forever changed by the experience. He had proven to himself and to the world that his training and commitment were genuine and unshakable. The incident had tested every aspect of his character and preparation, and he had passed that test completely. His grandfather's legacy of service had been honored, and Thomas had added his own chapter to the proud history of the Queen's Guard, demonstrating that the traditions of duty, honor, and unwavering dedication continued to live on in each new generation of guards who took their posts at the palace gates.